Welcome to Tony Martignetti Nonprofit Radio coverage of the National Conference on Philanthropic Planning. We are on the Riverwalk in San Antonio, Texas. My guests right now are Kathryn Miree and Turney Berry. Kathryn is principal of Kathryn W. Miree and Associates in Birmingham, Alabama, and Turney Berry is a partner in the law firm of Wyatt, Tarrant, and Combs in Louisville, Kentucky. Kathryn, Turney, welcome.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. Your seminar topic is Breaking the Mold, Options in Traditional Endowment Design. Kathryn, why don't we start with you? Why do we need to break the mold? What's wrong with traditional design?
Tony, I think if you look at the issues and lawsuits right now where donors are suing charities, what it really reveals is that perpetual is a long time, and it's not entirely practical to be very prescriptive in creating a long-term fund. So we're going to really look at the issues and talk about some of the solutions to the problems we see out there right now.
Okay, Turney, let's turn to the attorney. What are just some of the legal issues that we're seeing in these lawsuits that Kathryn's talking about?
Right. Well, you need to look at it from three different points of view. From the donor's point of view, a planner and a charity are promising that they will do certain things, and the donor believes them, and the donor's family believes them. And so the question is, can we really design an endowment that will work the way the donor wants over a very long period of time? Then you've got issues from the charity's point of view. Does a charity really want a particular endowment, particularly if it's very, very specific? It may be one thing if what you're doing is saying we want to pay for historical research, but if we say this is for research into the causes of World War I, in 100 years, that may not be something that the university say needs money for. And the last aspect that we'll be talking about is awareness of the effects on society. Is it good for us to have enormous accumulations in endowments? On the other hand, let's suppose that we cut back on those for any of a variety of reasons. Is that good for society? They're just complicated issues, and we like to start people thinking about those.
Okay, and Kathryn, as we're getting into the topic, let's define endowment. What are we talking about when we're in these funds? What do we mean?
That's a great question. To me, endowment is any pool of funds set aside for the long-term use of a charity or for charitable purposes. And so in that respect, it could be what we all consider a traditional endowment at a university or a hospital or any charity, where the donor makes a gift to the charity and says, don't spend the principal, use only the earnings. Or it could be a vehicle like a private foundation, which we see among a lot of the wealthy. And a private foundation is perpetual in purpose, and it is in truth a pool of funds. You're required by law to distribute 5% of your investable asset value, but that's an endowment. A supporting org could be an endowment. A donor-advised fund could be an endowment. A charitable lead trust could be an endowment substitute. So these are all funds where the principal is invested and the earnings are used for charitable purposes.
Okay, but as Turney pointed out, the donors may have specific things that they want to fund. So if we're going to be donor-centric, shouldn't we just allow them to do what they really want to do with their money and their gift?
I love talking about donor-centric and what that means. It doesn't mean letting the donor run amok with a charitable purpose that would take a charity off mission, for example. The Turney has a great example of that makes me smile.
Go ahead, tell the story, Turney.
My favorite one is, let's suppose that I wanted to go to my church and endow the singing of Amazing Grace. You can't use the money to sing How Great Thou Art, but you can use it to sing Amazing Grace. And so the pastor says, well, what are we going to do with that gift? We can have special robes for the singing of Amazing Grace. We can have a special riser for the choir to stand on. But all I'm really doing is disrupting the operation of the church. And charity should be very sensitive to that. And somebody should come to me and say, well, it's wonderful that you like Amazing Grace, and we can call the fund the Amazing Grace Fund, but we just can't administer a fund like that. And a reasonable donor is going to go ahead and change that if you get some thoughtful back and forth. It emphasizes, as Kathryn said, the importance, donor-centric. Donors want to help the mission of the endowment, the charity they're working with. So you need to meld those two.
And Kathryn, if you're, as Turney said, if the donor is reasonable and really wants to help the charity, aren't they going to be receptive to the explanation that kind of purpose for an endowment just doesn't suit us?
Two of the trends that I see that I think bear on this issue are, one, term endowments, and two, creating flexibility within the endowment and a method for or mechanism for change. I'll give you a good example. I had a donor walk in and wanted to create $1 million endowment for a program called Success by 6. And the conversation I had with that donor...
That was age 6, I assume, not 6 o'clock in the afternoon.
Right,
okay.
right.
Not trying to do it in a day.
Right.
6 years.
Success by 6 is an early childhood intervention, education intervention program that catches kids when they're 3 or 4 and prepares them to learn. And it's a critical time in their lives, and a lot of poorer families don't have that kind of support for children. And my question to the donor was, what are you really trying to accomplish? And when they said, I love these programs that go in and prepare young children, my response was, let's say that. Let's don't name a program that might not be here in a few years. Let's talk about outcomes. Let's talk about what you want to do. So donors are prescriptive because they haven't really thought of any other options, and I think our job as planners is to back them up a little bit and talk more about outcomes and purposes and terms.
So we have options. We have the limited term endowment.
Yes.
And what was the other that you mentioned?
Flexibility. Put in a plan B, a plan C in the event that the first purpose is no longer impactful, effective, meets the needs.
Okay. Now, Turney, in your work, are you seeing donors who are receptive to breaking the mold of what we've been doing for decades?
Sure. Let's take, for example, an arts group, the Louisville Orchestra. If I have a donor who wants to benefit the Louisville Orchestra and wants to create a very long-term endowment, it's pretty easy to persuade the donor that the fund should be for the benefit of orchestral music in Louisville, Kentucky, an example of which is the Louisville Orchestra, and that's what should be funded first. But if 100 years from now there's some other something, then the larger purpose is funding live classical music in Louisville. Mm-hmm. Today we can't really conceive of that in any other way than an orchestra. That may be true in 100 years, but who knows? Education is another really good one.
And you have the issue of bankruptcy. Our orchestra in Birmingham went bankrupt and took down with it a number of funds that donors had contributed. So in Turney's example, what do? How have you protected the funds? And one of our jobs as planners, if we're representing the donor, is to protect those funds for the use that they intended.
So what do you do in that situation? I mean, I hear that a lot from potential donors. What happens if the college or the orchestra doesn't exist any longer? How do we protect the donor?
Well, there are a number of ways you can do that, one of which is you can put the assets, the endowment, in a separate organization, in a philanthropic fund, a private foundation, a community foundation, a supporting org, where it is not the charities directly. So that's one way to do it. Another way is to have a gift over. It's a little extreme.
Mm-hmm. What does that mean, a gift over?
Well,
we have jargon jail here on Tony Martin, Nonprofit Radio.
Exactly.
My antennae are always up when I'm with an attorney.
Right. No, exactly. Well, we just
Go
talk
ahead.
in
What's
code.
that?
So what you do is you say
gift over.
As long as a particular organization is doing X, then the endowment will be theirs. But if not, it will go over to a second organization. So the second organization has an incentive to police what the first organization is doing. So let's say that what I do is I create an endowment for a hospital that's supposed to be used to support its women's programs, and for whatever reason the hospital stops doing that. It goes in and becomes a long-term care facility. If I have a gift over to another hospital, the other hospital is going to raise the red flag and say, oh, first hospital isn't doing this anymore. Where's our money? Well, that's a very good way to do it.
And you're finding nonprofits are willing to accept that oversight by another local nonprofit?
They are. I mean, but because again, they don't think they're ever going to get out of that business, and so it helps them do whatever it is they want to do. The harder ones, quite honestly, are something like a library, where you have donors who really want to fund collections. And you have to have the very difficult conversation, particularly with elderly people, that collections may not be books. And they really don't, when they say not books, they think, oh, it's going to be some endless room of computers and DVDs and a bunch of kids playing, and this is not what we want to do. And you have to say, well, that's not entirely true. If in the year 100 somebody had endowed the creation of papyrus manuscripts, you would have wanted them to fund Gutenberg, and they'll kind of, well, yeah, that's true, but those are harder conversations.
Okay. Kathryn, let's take a step back and think about some smaller organizations that really just want to, maybe they're at the stage where they say we need to have an endowment. We want to start an endowment. What should they be thinking of around the issues that you and Turney are concerned about?
I think the first place to start is the role of endowment, both internally. I always look at two cases for endowment. One is the internal case. Why do we need an endowment? How are we going to use it?
So the board is saying we need one. You want to question why? Okay.
Why?
Go ahead.
And why do you need one, and what is its role going to be? And I don't think people talk about that enough. And then that second case is, why should donors invest in the endowment? What is in it for them? What are they going to accomplish with an investment in endowment? So starting with purpose, the other thing I think of is the structure of the fund, the size of the funds. You don't want to be caught up with thousands of tiny little funds, and I see them all the time. You want to make sure you have some guidelines for how you accept endowment to make sure that it's not going to take you off mission, that you have the ability to say no, you know the criteria to say no, and that you have some flexibility built into that. All those things are important, and it's really hard if charities get to the point where we say they're desperate for money, they want more money. Most of them don't stop to think about why and what it's going to look like and how to structure it.
What are some of the inappropriate purposes that for which an organization shouldn't be getting into building an endowment?
Well, I see some charities say, well, if we would just have an endowment that would cover all our operations, we wouldn't have to raise money anymore. I personally push back from that one because I think...
why doesn't that make sense?
Well, I think raising money out there every year for what you do keeps you responsive to the public, and it's part of what you do as a nonprofit. It sounds very lazy to me to say we just want to cover our operating expenses. Another might be a church. I had this very example. Had gone through strategic planning to look at the issue of whether to start a church school. During that planning process, they decided not, because there were other parochial schools in the parish. It would take them off mission. Their mission was primarily community outreach, and they decided not to do that. A donor came along, left them a large gift to start a school, and they wisely turned it down. Why? Because it clearly would take them off mission.
Yeah. And Turney, in terms of structuring endowment from a legal perspective, what does the charity beginning that process need to be thinking of?
Well, you need to decide, is it going to be an internal endowment or an external endowment? Are you going to keep it on your books, or are you going to create an organization or create a fund at a community
the
foundation?
ways you mentioned earlier, community
Exactly.
foundation or donor advised,
Right.
or having donors use their own donor advised fund,
exactly,
etc. Okay, so
right. Do you want it in-house or do you not? And then what sort of restrictions are you going to impose? What sort of gifts are you going to solicit? One of the things that I find, at least, is that oftentimes endowments and plan giving generally, very unfortunately, serves a work avoidance function. It is, we've got somebody on staff, or the board says, oh, we've got a lot of older donors, we need to raise endowment dollars from them, but nobody really wants to go ask anybody for endowment money. So they say, we'll order some brochures and we'll mail the brochures out and we'll have a plan and we'll have a committee. And at the end of the day, they're shocked to discover that nobody gives any money. And so they then divert the person to doing special events, and 3 or 4 years later, somebody on the board says, we need to get serious about endowment, and we start the process all over again.
Yeah.
And you see it when you look at resumes. Most of the resumes among the smaller charities, certainly in our area, the plan giving officers have as much special event experience as they do plan giving experience. The ones where you have success are the people who are committed and they say, it's future. We're going after the future. All of fundraising at the end of the day is just telling your story. And if you have people in the organization who aren't comfortable telling the story, i.e. fundraising, that's a problem.
Yeah. Kathryn, you're shaking your head as Turney was saying future.
Oh.
Anything you wanted to say there?
No, I agree.
Okay.
I agree with him absolutely. I generally look at annual fundraising supporting operations, planned giving and deferred giving supporting endowment, because it's a one-time gift. It perpetuates the donor's ongoing gift. We know that those gifts come from the most committed donors. So I don't disagree with him at all.
Yeah. No, I thought maybe you were shaking your head in chagrin over organizations that might be doing what Turney's advising against. Yeah,
I do. I see it all the time.
And so how should we structure internally in terms of fundraising to avoid the problems that Turney is describing when we're starting an endowment campaign or program?
You know, I think an endowment campaign on its own is the hardest thing any charity will ever do. I look at it as part of the bigger picture, part of the bigger case to donors that they need to invest now and in the future. I see, I really think having people assigned to plan giving and having the discipline to allocate those gifts to endowment as quasi-endowment, which is board allocated as opposed to donor allocated.
Okay, let's talk a little about that, quasi-endowment. How does that work with the donor?
Okay, two real types of endowment. One is true endowment. That is where the donor places the restrictions on those funds that you cannot spend the principal, you may only use the earnings. The other is quasi-endowment, and quasi is board-allocated endowment. That means the gift comes in without the restrictions, but the board itself places it. Endowment, because it has the discipline to do that, and that is the easiest way.
Oh, so that's an unrestricted gift. That might just be a $1,000 annual gift.
Exactly.
And the board makes the difficult decision to not spend it.
Right.
And put it into its true endowment.
Right. And, you know, the other argument I usually give charities is if you budget estate gifts, you are basically budgeting death. And that is a little tricky.
In terms of the unrestricted gifts being allocated to endowment by the board, is there a policy or a guideline that you'd like to see, a certain percentage of unrestricted gifts being devoted to endowment?
I look at it more as all the testamentary gifts, the things that are triggered by the death of the donor. If the charity will put 100% of those in endowment, it will basically endow, in many cases, the donor's annual gift. I want them to have all that discipline, and then if they need, if you have policies, it's going to be how do we withdraw some of those funds? How do we use them?
That's so hard to do, though, especially in the midst of a recession still. But Turney, I see you nodding. You agree?
It is, but you can never make any progress, it seems to me, if you are always having to find new donors. You want to be able to tell the story to new people every year, but you want to continue to capture the story capture the people you've already told the story to. So if you've got a donor who gives you $1,000 a year, if you can get $10,000 as a bequest or as a longer-term gift of some sort, then this is good because they've basically funded their gift, and now I can go after the next person and I can actually expand and grow and develop in a way that it's very difficult to do if you every year are starting from scratch.
Yeah, and of course, Kathryn, as our consultant, we know that the cost of acquiring a new donor is considerably greater than getting a follow-up gift from an existing.
It is, and I look at it as maximizing the donor's role with the charity. If they are giving to you every year, you need to make that ask that they give in perpetuity, and many of them will. You're not going to find people walking around on the streets that are going to make endowment gifts that don't have any other connection to your charity.
No, you're looking for that commitment in terms of, and doesn't that commitment even flow to donors who are giving at small levels?
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Let's talk a little about that, Kathryn. Yeah.
I see direct mail organizations whose average gift size on an annual basis is very low. They don't have those high-end major gifts, and yet they're as committed. And they might leave an average estate gift of $30,000 or $40,000. It may not be as large as the major gift donors, but it's significant. No charity would turn that away.
So look to your small giving, your donors who are making small gifts, but doing it consistently. Maybe a decade or more, decades sometimes we see in long-standing organizations.
Right, that's the number one indicator. And what I have learned is that many of those donors make their only major gift at death because they can't afford to do it during life.
We have to leave it there. Been with Kathryn Miree, principal of Kathryn W. Miree and Associates in Birmingham, Alabama, and Turney Berry, a partner in the law firm Wyatt, Tarrant, and Combs in Louisville, Kentucky. Kathryn and Turney, welcome. And thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks. Enjoyed it.
The topic was Breaking the Mold, Options in Traditional Endowment Design, and you're listening to Tony Martignetti Nonprofit Radio coverage of the National Conference on Philanthropic Planning 2011.